Thank you very much, Julie, for those very important remarks. I think the points that have been raised so far have given us a lot of food for thought. I would even argue and say that it's a lot of feast for thought. Now, I have a long list of questions which could take us until the closing, but I'm not going to do that. Because I think we need to have the conversation, we need to pose the questions, we need to share ideas. Again, not just only about identification of the problems, but as the panel has actually done, identification of some of the potential solutions that we can actually help to create a world that is fit for children. I'm going to ask colleagues to introduce themselves when they take the floor. I would appreciate it if you limit yourself to just one comment or one question. And if time permits, we will actually come back to you. But again, of course, the questions, I know the temptation is there to actually venture into a whole range of violence against children-related issues. Believe me, I do have that temptation. But I encourage you to focus it in relation to the topic, promoting dignity, digital child dignity, so that we can actually get to some of the points that we want to address. The floor is open. Who wants to be an icebreaker? Please, introduce yourself, and I've given the guidance.
Here we go. Hello, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Leanna McDonald. I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. Thank you to this panel. There were some profound and very important things that needed to be said. One of the things, and I'm not going to reiterate my agreement with the foundations of the comments, but I do want to mention an area and a gap that I think does need to be addressed. So our organization operates Project Arachnid, which is a tool to help identify known images of child sexual abuse material. When that material is located, we issue notices to companies and providers around the world. What is really important is, even though we had big tech sitting here, we've issued probably to over 400 companies to date. And I think it's really important when we talk about industry, we have, and I keep kind of underscoring this, we have those who are proactive, we have those who are reactive to notices, we have those who are resistant, we have those who are non-compliant, and we have those who are complicit. And I think it's really important that we start to find ways that we are outing those companies who are in fact complicit and bad actors in this space, who are benefiting from the legal loopholes to be identified, benefiting from law enforcement being overrun and under-resourced to be able to follow up with legal remedies, and are also benefiting from legitimate companies who are unknowing or not wanting to know that they are providing services to bad actors. This is something that can be done soon. We need transparency, we need accountability, and we need to start calling out and naming those companies that are knowingly complicit in the active trade and availability of this material.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Mustafa.
Thank you. My name is Mustafa Ali from the Global Network of Religions for Children of Arigato International. I just want to underline what the previous speaker said in terms of transparency, accountability, and the need to call out those areas, institutions, companies that are, whether wittingly or unwittingly, facilitating child abuse. Now, from hearing some of the submissions today, I feel that we're not putting the child at the center, and that's what we need to do. We are putting technology at the center and not the child. And in the words of Julie, the last speaker there, I think we have to redefine privacy, and privacy that is going to support, that is going to put the child at the center, not those who are really wrecking their lives as children and as they grow up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mustafa. I have to be fair to all sides, so I'm going to take, maybe if anybody would like to make a comment, remark from my right. Okay, from the left, please, Cardinal, go ahead.
I find it very encouraging what everyone is doing, and I applaud that. Working with child advocacy groups and victims groups and law enforcement. A collaboration with them is very, very important. I know we have a fusion center in our local state police, and these people who are fighting it every day, if they become part of your solution, I think it'll make it much more effective.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'm going to check from my bag so that I don't miss out. The panelists, I'll come to you, I promise. Anyone from my bag? Okay. Let me give the opportunity to the gentleman at the back, and then I'll come to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Denton Howard. I'm the Executive Director of InHope. We have member hotlines, many of whom are represented in this room. Everything that's been said up to this point, I couldn't agree with more with. But what I would like to say is, when we're taking the point the gentleman in the front said about the victim, in every instance of CSAM, there's a victim behind that that has been abused, they didn't have a choice. But in terms of, from the hotline perspective, our first priority is to try and get that content removed as quickly as possible, and hopefully that it won't be re-uploaded. But it's not that simple, because that's just nipping off one of the heads of the hydra. We also have to look at all of the other elements, because there's the hotline aspect from removal, there's the technology to stop the upload, there's the education about hopefully reaching into the victims themselves so they can get some help, law enforcement, the governmental and legislative situation, where there are many different definitions of what is illegal or what is, and it creates ambiguities which are exploited by not the people who are present here, but the people who aren't present, in terms of exploiting the commercial interest in hosting that content. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me throw my 2 cents, because quite a number of them were actually comments, and I'm going to bring it to the panel. The first one that I want to flag is the concept of zero tolerance has been mentioned quite a few times today, multiple times. And in a number of instances, it means different things. I promise you, I spend quite a lot of time having conversations with states. Quite a number of states, they come to Geneva and they say that you can see that we have zero tolerance. You can see that our commitment is very real. Quite a number of states, they talk about zero tolerance and their commitment on the basis of the legislation that they have, the resources that they have put in place, the number of human resources that they have, the kind of funding that they've actually provided for pushing the boundaries in these issues and so forth. What does zero tolerance actually mean from a child dignity in the context of the digital space? Not just only from the point of prevention, but also from the point of view of accountability. I think that's one important point. The second point that I just want to flag is the cost of action versus the cost of inaction. Have we actually made a very strong case? Are we actually making progress to tell the story that the cost of inaction is much more expensive than the cost of action? Because I heard quite a lot of points about resources. But I'm going to throw it back to the panel. I've seen Maud's hand first, so please, Maud, you can go ahead and then we can continue.
Thank you. No, I wanted to react to the very important issues of privacy which have been raised here, and the suggestion that we need to redefine privacy. I don't take this as a technically, literally as a need to redefine it, because in my perception, it's not, privacy is not an absolute right. There are limitations, and if you interfere with that right, you are entitled to do that if the interference is proportionate to a legitimate aim. And the legitimate aim is the protection of the rights of others. So there's a question of measuring. And I know this is it's a legal argument, but I think at the end of the day, it can provide us with a solution, because, as I said, it's not, nobody can claim the right to do whatever he or she likes to do, because it's, you know, it's part of privacy, because there are limitations to that right. And of course it brings into discussions on judicial scrutiny, whether we need perhaps dedicated law jurisdictions, interim measures, all sorts of things which come into the discussion. But I just wanted to be very clear that make it clear that for me it's not an absolute right. Thank you.
If you want. Hani?
Yeah, thank you. I want to echo Maud's points here, because there are limits to privacy and there are limits to speech in the offline world. Can we please stop pretending that the online world is any different, number one. Number two, the core business model of social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, is violating your privacy. Can we please stop pretending that this is an issue of privacy? The core business model is to take your data and to monetize that. This is not a privacy issue. This is a line that is being used to obscure the fact that they don't want to take responsibility for their services.
Thank you very much. Ernie?
Two quick comments. One is, I think Commissioner Gabriel is here, Antonio Labrador-Jimenez is here. There's already a model. The e-privacy regulation in Europe basically created an inability to use these kinds of tools to identify content, and the European Union amended it to provide a narrow carve-out. Now, Commissioner, we think it's probably a little too narrow, but nonetheless, I think it makes the case that exceptions can be made. They should be narrow, surgical, limited for compelling purposes, but exceptions can be made. The second point I would make, Benyon, to your point about how we move decision makers in New York and Geneva and places like that, I think there are several challenges. It's why this particular meeting is so important. One is the data are poor. You can't use police data because few of these children report. Few of these children tell anybody. There are very few arrests. There are very few prosecutions. So the data are bad. Howard's addressing that through his efforts in those 14 countries. There is a lack of prevalence research. And for public policy makers, for decision makers, if you can't prove it's a problem, it must not be a problem. So the challenge of getting this on the global policy agenda is to generate data and dialogue. And frankly, I think the speech that Pope Francis made this morning is probably the single most important document we have to drive policymakers forward, because it identifies not only the existence of a problem, but it provides a kind of agenda, guidelines for addressing it. So I think that's why this meeting and Monsignor Sanchez's calling this together is so important, because we've got to get public officials to pay attention to it.
Thank you, Ernie. Robert?
Just two very small comments. One, Benyon, to underscore your point of the need to somehow start calculating the cost of action versus inaction. I think it's probably an argument that would go down well with governments. Not sure if it would appeal to the tech industry and other private companies. But I also want to say that it's not just about money. It's also about a moral responsibility that we all have. It's not just about money. And a second comment, which is also related about money, but it's different, is somehow bring into the discussion, and they're not present here today, the financing sector, the banking sector. There was a very encouraging pilot, I think it was a couple of years ago, just before I joined ECPAT, of our member in Sweden, working together with law enforcement and with the finance sector in Sweden, tracking, first identifying and then tracking hundreds and hundreds of small money transfers to the Philippines. And they found out that it was all going to very few addresses, and they were for live streaming. So this is one way, follow the money, it's one way to, that would help address this problem. Bring in Western Union, bring in PayPal, bring in the others that facilitate small payments.
Thank you, Robert, also for emphasizing the point that the notion that says more or less the lack of money is the root of all evils is not really a true reflection of what's happening on the ground. We're talking about a number of contexts and countries where the resources are available, but the priorities are actually elsewhere. I was on my way here, I picked an economist on the way, and it says that the world's billionaires, if they put their money together, would be the 8th largest economy. I just stopped and put it on the side. But Howard?
Loudly. Oh, even louder. Thank you. Also speak to the economic question, Benyon, that you raised in a couple of ways. Firstly, not to repeat what Ernie and Robert have said, but there is a data scarcity. We know that. But I think in terms of influencing political leaders, they need to understand both the prevalence, that's a data issue, but they also need to understand better that there are solutions. They need to understand what those solutions will cost, and that, frankly, is a political calculation and an economic calculation. What are the politics of acting on this, and what are the economic costs, the direct economic costs of acting on this, as well as the opportunity costs. In another part of the world, we're doing some work with the World Bank, looking at the opportunity costs and cost-benefit analysis of ending violence in schools. And I share that because that's an area where there is much more data available because it's been more historically collected by governments and others. And we're looking at specific interventions which reduce violence in and around schools, which actually includes online too. And from that, we're looking at costing those interventions in a model which we hope will equip and empower people around the world who need to make the case within their government to their finance ministry or their education ministry of why in making specific investments to end violence in schools is worthwhile. Because although we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, although we fundamentally believe in the rights of the child, it isn't enough. It hasn't been enough. So we need to consolidate that, we need to champion that, we need to build on that, we need to express it in different ways, but we must also have those economic costs. And I think there are links to be made. As I said, we're making that link with the education sector, which is a very well-organized, long-standing sector. In early conversations with the health sector, we look at the health sector now looking at the consequences of violence, including online violence against children, particularly in mental health, which has enormous direct costs to governments and others. But we just need to get better at getting the data, calculating those costs, getting them out there in a way that is that persuades those who take decisions, whether they're in finance ministries, other ministries in governments, or elsewhere.
Thank you. Julie, briefly. And then after that, Mr. Stefano, and I'll take a brief another round.
I was just going to add to that calculation. I think you know CyberTip Canada and NCMEC have done one of the first studies of the kind of, and just initial work on survivors of child sexual abuse material. And there's calculation there to be done on the long-term impact that is health, livelihood, and everything else. I hope that that will be in there as well.
Thank you, and your point ties very well with Howard's point earlier, that it's not just only the right thing to do, it's actually the smart thing to do. We obviously make the arguments on the basis of the human rights framework, because within the human rights framework, you don't make on the basis of the economic advantage and so forth. You do it because it's a right. But I think that's an additional argument that's not just only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. But Mr. Stefano.
Thank you. Now, the word accountability has been raised by different people. Well, it's proper to know that accountability concept is old-fashioned nowadays in very recent time, because what does it mean, accountability? That I am responsible for what I do. But that is not enough. In the last few decades, at the international level, both political scientists, moral philosophers, etc., they are putting forward a new notion of responsibility, much stronger. I am responsible for what I am not doing, even though I am in a position to do. So we had better stopping talk about accountability, because that is a way to manipulate the mind of people. Because it's not enough not to do bad. What is necessary is to do good. And if I am in a position to do something good and I refuse to do it without any other, that is responsible. The other point which was raised is about business model, etc. As we know, business models depends on the legal rules, because the market economy, it's like a game which can function under whatever rules are. Those who know economic history from the, let's say, 15th century onward, they can testify. The point is that unless we change the rules of the game, it is obvious that the companies, they take for granted the rules of the game, and they base on those rules their base model. So it is not enough to say this is the business model, because the business model can be changed, as we know from history. There is a recent book by Catherine Pistol. She has a chair of a commercial law at Columbia University. The title of the book is The Age of Capital. No, sorry. Yes, The Age of Capital. And there is a chapter dealing exactly with child abuse. It's, in my opinion, fascinating. He's a professor of, I repeat, at Columbia University, not a minor one, etc. And she deals exactly with this issue, that unless we change the rules of the game, there is nothing to be expected. In other words, we cannot count on the good willingness of people, etc., because that is not enough. And finally, cost-benefit analysis, etc., is based on utilitarian calculus. Now, if one is utilitarian from an ethical point of view, it's okay, perfect. But suppose that one is not utilitarian, one follows the ethical virtues, then cost-benefit analysis cannot function any longer as recent results. The point is that we take for granted that utilitarianism is the only ethical metrics for economic, but who said so? Where is it written? No way, because much before utilitarianism was created, the ethical virtue, which started with Aristotle and went on with Aquinas, etc., taught us how to do business in a proper way, avoiding the misfortune that we are occurring today.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Tracy Wimbert with Christian Brothers Investment Services. We're an asset management firm. And, people keep talking about putting children at the center of a lot of this discussion, but we have to step back, I think, and remember that the internet was not built for children. It was built for adults, and all the technology and platforms and everything that came from that is built for the adult experience. So now we have 1/3 of internet users worldwide being children, and how we deal with that problem where the product was not built for that user base. And people have over the years talked about, well, do we need a separate on-ramp for children on the internet, a separate section of the internet? We need to go back to kind of systems design discussions too, in terms of, is the internet fit for purpose for children the way it is currently designed, and how do you restructure something? This is a huge global conversation with massive economic implications. But think about how many more children will be online. Those numbers will keep going up. So that's one thing. Two, I've seen some encouraging activity at companies like starting to survey children on their experiences on the internet, to gather that information, to roll that back into how they think about their online safety programs, their initiatives internally. So they're not just hearing from academics and adults saying what a child's experience is, they're getting real-time information. So do we have principles out there from UNICEF and others that help guide other companies and other entities and governments maybe in collecting children, consultations with children? Why aren't children ever, in part of government and policy consultations and many other places where their voices actually need to be heard, so that we can take that actual experience and not the numbers saying this is their experience, and forming policy and tools, et cetera. The second, I guess, is, Ernie spoke well about the, onset of the dark web and what that was started for and what it became. What is to say this massive move to encryption isn't just a dark web 2.0? I would like to see a reassurance from government and technology companies that we're not going to repeat that same experience, because it seems very similar to me. And my last point is, I wanted to know whether or not we should really be focusing on cryptocurrency and the impact it will have on CSAM and child exploitation, because I don't see that mentioned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Briefly, Ms. Joanna.
As Childhood USA, but also a Broadband Commissioner, I have to say that the objective of the Broadband Commission and its working group was, for the first time for the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, to really focus on how do we prioritize children online and how do we prioritize their safety. And I want to remind everybody that among the commissioners, we have companies that are represented here who have been part of this working group. We have regulators, we have representatives of the UN system. If you look at the recommendations of the report, they very much are aligned with the recommendations we have been hearing today. And there is one thing that's really missing, and I think I'm missing it in this conversation, and it's how much would it cost to really make children a priority. And I think Howard was mentioning that education space and the investments. From my experience working on the Millennium Development Goals and health, the Global Fund for Health, HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, made a huge difference. Without it, we would never have reached as far as we have reached the reduction of child mortality or maternal mortality or lowering the malaria incidence. When we looked at the MDGs and education, more children got to school, but they didn't learn more. Why? Because there wasn't a fund for education. So while we are discussing what needs to be done, when I at the same time hear Howard mentioning a few $1 million or euro, and when I hear Julie talking about 15 million over 3 years, it's nothing. We are dealing with a horrible pandemic that is now, together with connectivity, going to reach the places where most of the children live today, in the developing world. It's going to be 1 in 2 of the internet users is going to be a child, in places where there is zero support for them, offline, and definitely not online. So we have a bigger problem to deal with, and it's really time to act and prioritize the actions. That's what our next step should be.
Thank you. Time is not on our side, but very briefly, you'll be the last speaker from the floor.
Thank you. Leonardo Real, CCO of Tether. I just wanted to kind of address the fact that the production and distribution of child pornography is a business after all. And so it's very important to follow the money, as many have said previously. And so I'm very excited to hear about from Stuart Davies in the world of finance, and I implore that people also read Following the Money Guide, which was published by the OSCE earlier this week, to which Joseph Murray contributed to. In my world of cryptocurrencies, we have found that a large part of the distribution of child pornography is actually paid for through Bitcoin. In fact, the world's largest child pornography bust was recently completed, and it was largely through the ability to trace blockchain transactions for Bitcoin. And so if it will be the case that technology companies will stand up a permanent body that looks at child dignity and all these issues, I really would implore that cryptocurrency exchanges and companies be included in that so that they can help this issue by following the money in that realm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any of the panelists, maybe on a reverse order, who might like to make very brief remarks, and we can start with Julie, if you want, briefly. Fine. Howard?
To say thank you for the conversation, and just to say something a bit further on the economic piece, since it's been picked up, is that whatever the right way to get the data, whatever the right way is to tell the story, whatever the right way is to package the numbers so it persuades political and other leaders to act, we must never reduce the child to an economic unit. Keep the child at the center of this in all we do.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, Benjamin, because I think almost everything has been said already today. We need action. We all know what the problem is, and it's growing big in scale. So we need action. I'm very interested to hear tomorrow from religious leaders where their thinking is, where their commitment to cooperate is, both within the religious and faith ecosystem, but also with law enforcement, with tech companies, with civil society, with others. So I'm very looking forward to tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. I think that it's important to recall at this moment that reparation is a very important dimension of accountability. It's too often forgotten, and it should be a natural part of our response to the suffering inflicted on a child. And when we are talking about these ICT-facilitated crimes, for me, for instance, if you talk about online streaming, I see, in terms of criminal law, complicity in terms of the role of the service providers. And so I would like to bring together the need for providing reparation and the criminal responsibility of those who facilitate the online viewing of child abuse.
Thank you, Mr. Stefano.
as I said, I would stress the necessity to put more attention on the demand side. There is a phenomenon which was started a century ago, which is called the voting by wallet, because we are undervaluating it. But in the present days, voting by wallet, in other words, in asking the demand side to operate in a way in order to send messages to the production side, it's very relevant. By the way, it's also costless. The other aspect that has to do with the problem of, in other words, we have to raise the international agency the necessity of a sort of a global governance, not government, governance. If you read the last part of Caritas in Veritate by Benedict XVI, the last few numbers, they refer explicitly to the necessity to move step forward in the direction of creating a global governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hani, followed by Ernie.
As much as I love Italy, as gracious as our hosts from the Vatican and from the United Arab Emirates have been, I don't want to be here again next year. The ratio of talk to action is not encouraging. We got to quit having these conversations. They're productive, but we keep having them. And I'm tired of having the conversations. We got to start doing something. And at the next meeting, we have to ask not just what should we do, but what have we done in the intervening year.
Benyam, two quick points. One is context in terms of the importance of the technology companies in all of this. Mr. Mari is right about the economics of this, and Stuart Davis will talk about it tomorrow. But overwhelmingly, these are not economic crimes anymore. There is certainly an element of using cryptocurrencies in the digital economy for commercial purposes, but you don't have customer seller loyalty on the dark web. You don't know who you're dealing with. There are risks. The U.S. Department of Justice just shut down one group, one pedophilia group on the dark web with 432,000 members. And my response to that was, how is that possible? How can there be 432,000 human beings interested in graphic images of young children, prepubescent children, including infants and toddlers, being raped and sexually assaulted? And the answer is, what internet anonymity has provided is the ability to network with people of like interest and exchange images and exchange fantasies and technologies and techniques with virtually no risk. And so the only point I would want to make in summation is that's overwhelmingly what this problem is. And until we deal with that, and until we create some modicum of risk, it's going to do nothing but grow. And I think I've said enough, Benyam.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to use 1 minute or so and wrap up. I think there are a number of important points that have come out. I don't think I'll be able to do justice to them, but I'll just flag a few points. I think technology as part of the solution has been emphasized by a number of speakers, including Ernie, Hani, and so forth. And when I started, I actually talked about the sense of urgency. And I think the conversation has reinforced that point, that the sense of urgency and the urgency of now in a very loud and clear manner to me. And I'm happy that the panelists did not only talk about the challenge that we're facing. We face many challenges. We believe it. We live in it. But they also proposed some potentials that could actually be picked on and be adapted to the context that they need to be applied on to actually create a world that is more fit for children. Now, from the conversations, it's also important to see the intersectionalities that actually exist. We're no longer operating in a silos. When someone was talking about the MDGs, and now we've moved to the SDGs, one of the important and significant lessons that we've learned, particularly for children, is that the notion of silos, those working on human rights, those working on humanitarian, those working on development, and so that silos is actually not helping us. And particularly for children, it has led to leaving a number of children behind, because one of the lessons from the MDGs was that we were reaching the easiest to reach, and the difficult to reach were actually the ones who fell between the cracks. And the tendency, the notion, we said quite a number of things about data and the importance of data, and the notion about research and putting money on research. some of the challenges that we face is not just only data, it's about disaggregated data. One of the biggest challenges in creating a world that is fit for children that we're facing is the notion of national averages. Because national averages usually don't tell the details. Who are actually the children that are being left behind? Which part of the country are they coming from? Which ethnicity are they from? What religious background do they have and so forth? Those details need to be captured when we talk about data, because national averages are not that helpful. Now, I know Mr. Stefano mentioned about the new economic order. In my day-to-day life, I'm an academician, and the other day I was talking about the golden rule. And one of my students said, these days the golden rule is out of the window, because currently the golden rule is one who owns the gold makes the rule. In a number of instances, in terms of child dignity, we actually get to see that, and it's unfortunate. I come from a continent which is often neglected in this conversation about child dignity and the digital media. But believe it or not, the African continent is actually more or less the new frontier. Because when the legislation is being tightened in different parts of the world, the perpetrators actually shift tack. They move to the areas which are easier to target. And children's rights are actually a very critical issue for the African continent, because as we speak, by the year 2030, the majority of children, 42% of children that will be born all over the world will actually be born on the African continent. So it's not an afterthought, it's not something that's just only affecting the Western world, it's actually a global challenge that we're actually trying to deal with. Two final points. The point on moral compass was emphasized time and again. And something actually captured my attention this morning from the Holy Father. And he said, a new alliance, and I quote, between all institutions and centers of education. And then again, quote, a contribution to this can be made not only by sound ethical reasoning, but also by a religious vision and inspiration which has universal scope because it places respect for human dignity. It's not an issue that is important just only for one religion and another religion. It's actually a responsibility for every single religious order. And the moral compass that we're actually working with is one of the challenges that we're facing. And I'm happy to say that all speakers, and I'm glad the question was not raised that we didn't make the link with religious leaders, all speakers spoke about the role that religious leaders need to play in making sure that these issues are put front and center with our efforts to create a world that is fit for children. I sometimes ask for forgiveness than for permission. When we started, I said it's an A team. I actually have to say that it's an A+ team, and I'm sure you'd agree with me. Before I conclude, I also want to thank the organizers. I promise you, personally, I go to a number of meetings all over the world, all over the year. My carbon footprint is probably bad, but those meetings that I often value are the ones with one keyword, follow-up. I'm happy that we had the meeting in 2017, and I'm very happy that we're actually doing the follow-up in a way during the conversation that we're having here. So within that context, I definitely want to thank the organizers for what we are having today and tomorrow. A final point. You can see that from the speakers, we say the convention is celebrating 30 years. The convention is not counting its days, it's making its days count. We are having a number of panel speakers here who are not counting their days, they're making their days count. The other day I saw an advert in New York. It said, taking action versus talking action. The panelists, I get the sense, are not talking action. They're actually taking action. So with those remarks, I want to ask everybody to stand up, preferably everybody, and the panelists to stay seated so that we can actually clap our hands and thank them for the fist photo that they gave us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hand over to the organizers. You've been an amazing participant, but thank yourself as well, and we will see you tomorrow. I hand over to the organizers. Thank you very much.